So welcome everyone to our webinar, How to Navigate CalOSHA's Workplace Violence Prevention Code. My name is Sam Miller, and I'm the West Coast Account Executive for Align Technologies. And we've got a great webinar planned for you guys today. I want to kick things off, though, just with a little audience participation. So if we can put up our poll, I want to hear from everybody here. How prepared do you feel your organization is for the upcoming code that's going into effect July 1st? Now, this is completely anonymous. I can't see who's answering here, but it does help us frame the conversation as we get into the meat of the call. So I want to leave that open here for a couple seconds, and then we'll jump into introducing our speakers. So, appreciate everyone's participation. I think we can go ahead and close that. We'll get into introducing our speakers here. Oh, there we go. Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to start with ladies first. So I want to introduce you all to Janan Guillaume. She's our very own VP of Product, VP of Product here at Align Technologies, and she's been the visionary behind a lot of the features behind our system and helping solve our customers' problems. She's also the co-host of our podcast, Women in Construction Innovation. And Janan's going to be moderating our discussion today. So thank you, Janan, for joining us today. Excited for the discussion. I'm also very excited to introduce you to John Surma. John's a shareholder at Ogletree Deacons. And if you aren't familiar with John or following John on LinkedIn or his podcast, I highly, highly recommend. He shares consistent content that's easy to understand and super actionable. John has tons of experience representing clients before OSHA, MSHA, other entities like that, and we'll be contributing that legal perspective to our discussion today. And last, but certainly not least, we've got Steve Polich on the call here too. He is our co-founder of Safety Reports and Veteran CSP. Really excited for Steve to be here. He's been a great mentor for myself and other folks at the company, just understanding safety and learning our platform. Steve has extensive experience, we'll say multiple decades, Steve. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong there.
At least 30 years.
Right? just a few. With the application of safety in a business setting. So he's going to be contributing that perspective to the discussion today. And then thank you all for joining us today. I'm super excited for the discussion. So let's kind of get into the agenda for the call today. First, what we're going to do is we're going to define what workplace violence is and why you should prioritize it. Then we'll move into our panel discussion where we have some questions. We also want to answer your questions too. So I'm going to encourage the audience to submit your questions at the bottom of the window in the QA section. We'll be monitoring that, and we want to answer your questions. So I'm going to encourage you guys to start doing that now. So that way we can get right to those. And then we'll close our discussion with summary and some takeaways, as well as some resources like how to connect with us and some CalOSHA resources that are available to you. Now, I've got one more poll question before I hand things over to Janan. So if we can put that up. What aspect of the Workplace Violence Prevention Plan Code are you most interested in learning today? Is it an overview, steps to developing a prevention plan, legal considerations, best practices, tools and resources? You let us know. So I'm going to leave that open here so to encourage some participation from the audience here. And I think we'll go ahead and close that poll. Thank you all for your participation. Looking forward to sharing those results here a little later in the call, in the meat of our call here. So looking forward to that. And Jeanette, I think now's a good time as ever to hand things over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Sam. It's good to be here with you today with you, with John, Steve, and to learn from John and Steve on these new workplace violence requirements. So what we want to do is start with just a baseline definition of what we mean when we say workplace violence. And that really is any act of violence or threat of violence that occurs at a place of employment. So now that we have that shared understanding, you'll see on the next slide that workplace violence at the national level is fairly pervasive when we look at data related to the number of people affected, the number of injuries and deaths. And this data helps us really understand why it's important to prioritize prevention. Prevention in and of itself will really help us get in front of a number of adverse impacts. If we look at the next slide, things like emotional and organizational impacts that can bring down our workers and bring down our business, right? So we'll look at the next slide and then start jumping into the panel. This is how it's stated in the California Labor Code to adopt a comprehensive workplace violence prevention plan, train employees on workplace violence, and log acts of workplace violence. And as mentioned earlier too by Sam, this is effective July 1st of this year. And now we can hop into the real meat and potatoes of this webinar and into the panel discussion so we can learn more and really get some tools from our experts here. So before we kick off with a question, let's find out how we did with those survey results. So let's throw up that first question. How prepared does everybody feel? All right. Well, that's very good. Everyone's pretty much somewhat prepared. Maybe by the end of the webinar, we'll all feel somewhat prepared, if not very prepared. But there's a lot to dig into. Let's take a look at the second question. Okay, so we're kind of split here. We might as well just talk about it all. But the one that won out at 31% was best practices for training and implementation, followed up by steps for developing a plan. So we have the way that we worked together on coming up with the content for this is we developed a number of questions. And I think a good place to start, kind of like we just did, is let's get an overview of that new regulation. And then let's jump in with John, and then let's jump in with Steve on some best practices. So John, why don't you kind of kick us off and give us all that overview so we have that shared understanding.
Well, Janana and Sam, thank you for the invitation. To our audience members, appreciate you being here. Steve, I look forward to presenting with you. Relative to the overview, I want to talk about basically 6 different topics. Topic number 1 is applicability, who this applies to. Topic number 2 is the concept of the workplace violence prevention plan. The third topic is the violent incident log. The fourth topic is employee training. The fifth topic is record keeping. And then the last is enforcements and, standards and enforcement. So applicability. In a nutshell, the law applies to almost every employer in California, their employees, their places of places of employment, as well as employer provided housing. So to the extent that you have a workforce that you also house, you're going to have some obligations relative to that housing. There are some exemptions. So there are certain healthcare facilities, those that fall under 3342 of Title VIII, facilities that are operated by the Department of Correction and Rehab. And interestingly enough, the term from the statute is compliant law enforcement agencies. So there are law enforcement agencies that actually are covered by this. And then employees teleworking from a location of the employee's own choosing. The employer cannot have any responsibility for that location, selecting it, et cetera. And then the last is certain small workplaces that have less than 10 employees, and those employees are not accessible to the public. In terms of the workplace violence prevention plan, this second point, so there is an obligation that employers establish, implement, and maintain a written workplace violence prevention plan. Note I say written, and I will enforce written multiple times throughout this process, as everybody on this call should be aware. But if you're not aware, OSHA really takes the position, CalOSHA really takes the position that unless something is reduced to writing, it didn't necessarily happen. So you can't just say that we have one that's communicated verbally. It has to be in writing. The plan has to involve the employees in the creation. So consistent with your injury and illness prevention plan, your IIPP or I2P2, depending upon kind of what generation of safety professional you worked with in the past, you have to involve employees in the creation of your workplace violence prevention plan. It has to be specific to each work area. I think the way that's ultimately going to sort out is that it's going to be specific to kind of general categories of work areas, not necessarily super specific, so that if you have a construction company, as a for instance, it's probably going to be kind of depending upon where they're at in the stages of construction, as well as where the construction is actually taking place. I don't think it's going to have to be project by project specific. It's going to have to include hazard identification, as well as coordination with other employers. So if you're on a multi-employer site, or if you're in a location with multiple employers, the plan's going to have to address kind of how you interact, how the controlling employer impacts the controlled employees and employers, et cetera. The plan also has to include reporting procedures, retaliation prevention, training, communication to the employee workforce, emergency response, inspections, hazard correction, post-incident procedures, and steps to review the plan's effectiveness. This should all sound a whole lot like what you're required to do with your IIPP. And if you're not familiar with what an IIPP is, let me encourage you to get a little help in developing IIPP. The third leg of this process is going to be creating the violent incident log. So that's a log like any other OSHA log that relates to incidents of violence. It has to include incident details, the type of incident, descriptions, perpetrator classifications, incident circumstances, locations, consequences, and information about the person completing the log. The fourth point is employee training. So employers have an obligation to train when their workplace violence prevention plan is initially created, as well as annually thereafter. And then if essentially new hazards or new workplaces are introduced. Anytime somebody comes in kind of mid-year, you have to train them, and you have to provide training annually. The training has to include, the plan, the terms of the plan, the definitions under the plan, the reporting process, hazards that have been identified by the employer, what corrective actions the employer is taking, the violent incident log, and give employees an opportunity to ask questions and receive answers. If the plan changes mid-year, you have to retrain. The fifth piece is record keeping. So these are records relating to your effort to identify hazards in the workplace, the training on the plan, the violent incident logs, and incident investigations. There's different requirements relative to retention, but be clear that you are going to have a record retention requirement here. If CalOSHA shows up and they ask for logs, these are no different than them asking for your OSHA 300, 300A type logs. The last piece is enforcement and standards. So CalOSHA will be able to enforce the law through citations and civil penalties. There is no current CalOSHA standard relating to the workplace violence prevention plan. It's going to be developed and adopted by the board relatively soon. But subdivisions B through G of the law go into effect July 1, 2024. I think Sam already mentioned this, but if she didn't, there's no grace period. It literally starts July 1, 2024, and you better be compliant. Now, you know, in terms of all the contours and details, I would expect that there's going to be some development over time. And so if your plan isn't necessarily as comprehensive as CalOSHA would like it to be, you're probably going to see some leniency and some flexibility there. But from the standpoint of you don't have a violent workplace violence prevention plan, or you don't have a violent incident log, I guarantee you they're going to issue you citations. Janan, I give it back to you.
Yeah, wow, John, thank you so much. That's a lot of information and really good stuff there to give us all that kind of base understanding. So, and the last point being very key there, you know, there's no wiggle room here. Let's all be prepared by July 1st. So, Steve, with that in mind and knowing kind of where everybody wants us to head next, what best practices can you recommend for developing and implementing a comprehensive plan?
Well, I would start by using the template that CalOSHA put out there. They gave us a really good template to work from. And you could take that, and I know John mentioned the IIPP, the Injury Illness Prevention Program. Mostly in California, I'm sure well aware of what that program entails. You can take that template that CalOSHA's provided you and include it in that plan, or it could be a standalone document. So either way, get the written program in place. Make sure that it is very specific to your operations. Again, John mentioned each job site may have various different stages of construction and different applications. That to me is going to be the most difficult part of setting this thing up, is coming up with a plan that's going to work effectively for most of your job sites. At the same time, you have offices and you need to address that as well. So you might have a separate plan with different risks associated with that environment. You know, and I sat down and I thought, you know, the first thing I do as a loss control person is I look at the big picture, and I have to try and anticipate risks, evaluate what those risks are, and then come up with some sort of mitigation to address them. Essentially, that's what you're all going to be doing with your workplaces. So look at your workplace and identify where you think the risks are. I would suggest, again, you're going to kind of use a multidisciplinary or disciplinary approach where you pull in folks maybe from HR, your general workforce. They're required to be involved in the process through CalOSHA. Reach out to maybe somebody on your insurance company, whether it's your carrier or broker, and see if they have loss control representatives. There's some experience in this. Maybe they could sit in on some of your initial meetings as you're putting your plan together and evaluating risks. There's plenty of trade associations out there. I'm sure they're going to be offering their services, whether it's ABC, AGC, National Safety Council. There's going to be folks out there that you can lean on for support. And then maybe consider pulling in law enforcement, local law enforcement, and get their intake as you're putting your plan together. But with this multidisciplinary approach, and you pull in all these folks to help you put the plan together, a big part of that's going to be performing a risk assessment. There's a tool out there I think a lot of folks are familiar with, the risk matrix, where you evaluate potential risks based on the severity or what the impact can be on your operations, as well as the frequency. You know, how likely is this event going to happen? For example, schools, they've been doing this for a long time. I've had some loss control experience working with schools. Some golf courses, they have you know, bars and clubhouses and stuff where, of course, on the golf course, people are drinking and they could get belligerent. Some retail stores, gas stations, where you have to look at all these potential risks and you have to rate them. So, for example, schools, they look at the threat of active shooters as obviously very critical, has a very severe potential outcome. but despite maybe what you hear in the media, the likelihood is just not that great, right? So they're going to have fewer events like that, but the severity is very high. At the same time, if you ask them, have you ever had any bullying on the schoolyard, any fights break out, any, at a sporting, after school sporting event, whatever, they're going to say, oh, absolutely, we deal with that all the time. The severity tends to be less for those, but on a much higher frequency. So they're going to put this into this this risk matrix chart. And once you do that with your work environment, you have to decide which ones you're going to address first. And it's suggested that you look at the ones with the severe outcomes as kind of your priority areas to focus on. So with that being said, in the name of full disclosure, I have not done a lot of risk assessments for workplace violence in the construction setting. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this over the past week, and I would love in the Q&A section for anybody that feels comfortable, provide us some input as to the type of events, workplace violence events that you've dealt with. And again, those are any type of physical act imposed by maybe somebody within your workforce, somebody outside the workforce. It also is the threat of violence. It could be as simple as an email or a text message to somebody saying, hey, I'm going to knock your teeth in after we get off work today. Doesn't have to actually incur, a violent act doesn't have to actually incur. So kind of evaluate where these come from in your various work sites. So, and John probably knows the different types of violence much better than me, but there's 4 types of violence that CalOSHA wants you to look at. And one is somebody coming onto your site that doesn't have any purpose for being on your site. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, we have valuable tools, equipment, supplies on our work site. So the only possibility I would see in my mind is somebody coming onto your site that shouldn't be there is somebody's coming on to steal something, right? And most likely that's going to happen after hours. You're not going to have anyone there, but there's no guarantees of that. You might have some employees on site during those events, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that. So that's the type of violence that you need to look at. That's what CalOSHA categorizes as type 1 violence. And it goes on down the line. Type 3 and 4, if you guys get into the standards, are probably the ones I would suspect that you'll deal with the most. Maybe type 3, which is an employee or an ex-employee threatening or actually harming an existing employees. So go through all those scenarios, decide which ones are most frequent and then which ones have the highest severity, rate them, and then address your plan to deal with those. And the template, again, that CalOSHA gives you is pretty straightforward. It's real easy to go in and update it to make it specific to your needs. The hardest part is trying to determine what types of violence and situations that you're going to have to deal with to build into the plan. So work in that, a team of individuals that are going to be able to help you come up with those scenarios and get them documented. It's interesting, and I did want to point this out because I know I'll forget, but somebody asked when I was talking to a friend of mine on this about animal attacks. And CalOSHA does include animal attacks in this, which is interesting because as you read through their violence, the types of violence that they list, it's always person on person. They don't ever reference animals, but under that scenario, you guys are going to have all sorts of issues to deal with. I had a contractor that an employee got bit by a spider, snakes, a raccoon, you name it, trying to remove debris from the site, right? They're taking old pallets out, all of a sudden they get injured. Is that a workplace violence event that needs to be in the log? I would suspect yes, based on the Q&A that's been provided by CalOSHA. So again, having multiple people help you with that risk assessment is going to be key.
Yeah, those are great points, Steve. A lot to think about, and thankfully there's that template that kind of lays it all out for you. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit next just about kind of, let's assume we've got our plan in place. The training, generally speaking, are there best practices around keeping employees up to speed? Once you've got all this documented and you're starting to have to fulfill that area of compliance, now you've got to train everybody. How do we get everybody, thinking about this and compliant, and then going into work, into the job site with that in mind?
Yeah, is that directed towards me, Janelle?
Yeah, why don't you take that, Steve, and then maybe John has some other thoughts he can add to that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure you'll be able to add quite a bit to whatever I have to say on this topic, but training is obviously key to any policies that you implement. You know, we're not just talking about the workplace violence prevention policy, which again, you have to have in place, but there's going to be a lot of little policies tied to that, like harassment, you know, any type of bullying policies that you have, disciplinary action. These are all part of that. So when we talk about training employees on workplace violence, there's a lot of policies kind of related to the topic that need to be pulled into this as well, in my opinion. But it's very clear that CalOSHA is going to require that you train employees before they're put into an environment where they could be exposed to that risk. So you're not going to hire somebody, put them out there, and then maybe a week later train them on the policy. That doesn't meet the requirements. So they technically need to be trained prior to being placed into that environment. And then they have an annual training requirement. We're not talking toolbox talks here. I mean, I don't think a 5-10 minute toolbox talk is going to meet the needs at all as far as CalOSHA is concerned. I don't think that's fair to your employees to expect them to understand the policy in that amount of time. So there's no set time frame on this, but I would suggest at least an hour training set aside to go through the policy and what the requirements are and how to report incidents and you know, how to de-escalate violent situations, any type of mitigating factors. That all needs to be included in the training. So at very least, I would suggest an hour initial training to get everybody up to speed on this, and then maybe a few toolbox talks along the way to reinforce some of the key elements of your plan throughout the year. And then again, make sure any new employees get trained before they get into that environment. And if you have any changes, significant changes that impact your policy, those need to be conveyed to the employees as well. Give you an example. My wife's a dietitian. She's gone through workplace violence training at a hospital, major hospital here in the Midwest. And the policy addresses active shooter. And that's it. And they had a situation at a clinic that she was working at where one of the healthcare providers was assaulted. They were in an exam room one-on-one with somebody. They're doing a lot of nutritional advice, and they have folks that are coming in with all sorts of emotional baggage, this, that, and the other. So they're unstable. Some of them can be a little bit to begin with. And this person got assaulted and had no way to notify anybody of the situation in a timely manner. So they made a change to the plan, and rightly so, they should, right? So we have a risk that they didn't address in the original plan. They gave everybody, they put a buzzer, a notification alarm, remote thing in each exam room. Well, my wife is PRN. She doesn't work every day. She wasn't part of the initial training. She had no idea that was implemented. She's at work one day. She sees this thing, doesn't know what the heck it is. So she's telling me a little bit about this. And I'm thinking in terms of our meeting here today that, you know, this is exactly what CalOSHA is trying to address is you got a major change to your plan. You cannot just assume that everybody's going to know what it is and how to deal with it. You got to make sure everybody's trained on it. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I do think, John, maybe you can speak to as a follow-up to around what do you do if something happens July 1st or July 2nd, and you know you're not 100% in compliance. What are some of the repercussions for non-compliance, and some of the things that can help everybody on this webinar understand what they need to prioritize when it comes to getting that document and getting everybody trained?
I apologize, I was muted. First of all, I think Steve's comments are spot on. I would expand it a little bit to say, I don't think any training on any policies or procedures of significance should be relegated to toolbox talks or anything like that. I mean, you know, OSHA in all its various and sundry forms, whether it's CalOSHA or federal OSHA, are really starting to drill in with employee interviews relative to what they retained from the employer's training sessions. And so I really do think that from the standpoint of the training, it needs to be, you know, in-depth, detailed, and, you know, quite frankly, an hour may be the starting point, depending upon the workplace and workforce that you have. You know, if it's a particularly, you know, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of lower skill, lower intellect workforce in a challenging workplace, that's a different story than if you're talking about, a bunch of skilled professionals working in an office where, the risks are just, dramatically different. From the standpoint of the kind of, it's July 1, we haven't done what we're supposed to do, what are our priorities? My number one priority would be pulling down the template that CalOSHA provides. And I agree with Steve. It's a very, very good starting point. Similarly with the IIPP, there's a template. It's a very good starting point. But bear in mind, it's a starting point. You can't put your name at the top or the company name at the top and a responsible person's name at the end and say, okay, we're done. We're washing our hands. We're moving on. You have to get that plan. You have to just customize it and tailor it to your workplace. And because of the things that Steve and I have mentioned, this is more customization and tailoring than with a lot of programs, because it's the hazards that are identified, as well as the workplaces that are involved, and the contours and the differences. And bear in mind, there's a form of violence that I think covers it, and OSHA considers it type 1 violence, and that's the unwanted person who comes into your workplace. But that unwanted person coming into your workplace may not actually cross into your workplace. It could be the person that's going by in a car and decides to shoot a weapon into your workplace. And so, having that plan in place day one, or if you don't get it done by day one, day two, or whenever you ultimately do get it in, that's crucially important. And obviously, some of what we're talking about really only becomes crucially important when an incident happens. And so you may have some grace period from the standpoint of no workplace violence incident or any other incident that would trigger CalOSHA's attention takes place. But I wouldn't rely on that. I mean, I would be prepared day one, be ready to go. My priorities would be getting my plan in place. And that's not simply a matter of sitting down and jotting in names and a few pieces of information. I mean, you have to do the hazard assessment. You have to involve employees in the process, et cetera. So, I mean, this isn't something that you can do in 20 minutes in your office. The other thing that I would do as rapidly as humanly possible would be getting the training done. If you have those two pieces taken care of, you can't train unless you have a program. You're not going to get a lot of grace from OSHA, but if you don't have a violent incident log and it's July 3, there's probably a reasonably fair likelihood you haven't had a violent incident yet. And so you probably don't have to have that log in place. But if we're getting on 6, 8 months, a year past July 1, and you don't even have that piece of paper generated, CalOSHA is going to take a deeper dive, even if they're only coming in to do an inspection about an employee complaint relative to heat or some other incident. You're going to know for the next couple of years, one of the things that's going to be kind of a standard part of every inspection is going to be, what does your workplace violence prevention program look like? And what have you done and how have you changed it, et cetera? And so it's critically important to be done by July 1. But if you're not done by July 1, my order of priorities would be getting the plan put in place. And then number 2, training everybody that you can possibly get trained.
Yeah. I wonder, maybe we should come back in a year and see how everybody's doing. But are there any key differences of kind of reporting a case of workplace violence or versus these other types of incidents that people are currently reporting on? Is there a different way you have to go about reporting that to be in compliant with legal requirements?
Well, so there are, but I mean, at the end of the day, from the standpoint of the exact procedure that's involved, until CalOSHA actually, and then Standard Board actually issues its regulations, I think that, we're kind of guessing about what the contours of that are actually going to look like. I mean, I think from the standpoint of, your major incidents. So if you're talking about something that you would currently have an obligation to report to CalOSHA, those obligations are not going to change. I mean, it's the exact same situation that you'd have today. You know, it's you know, if you have a hospitalization, if you have a death, if you have an injury that's disabling or disfiguring, you know, you're going to have to have that in place. You know, there's kind of two components to this, though. You know, one of those components is that the employee has to have a process that the employee can report to the employer something that's happened. And, you know, from the standpoint of that process, you know, a lot of folks are concerned about their workplace being subject to a law enforcement investigation because somebody was subject to some violence, or them potentially being part of a criminal investigation. And this law really compels you have to provide a pathway for your employees to be able to report to you, and then you take it from there in terms of whatever CalOSHA ultimately is going to say relative to your reporting obligation, or alternatively, that they can report to law enforcement and you cannot retaliate against that person. And the definition of retaliation, and you have to keep this in mind, is super, super broad. And it's ultimately, it's not there yet in California, but it's starting to creep into, even if you promote somebody, that's considered retaliation. So it's, like I said, it's not there yet, but it's going to be getting there. And you can't do anything to the person that reports it or picks up the phone and calls law enforcement because they don't think that speaking to their employer is going to be effective. Steve, I don't know if you have a different read on it.
I agree with that. I would make sure that you encourage employees to report not just the physical acts of violence, but the threats, right?
Yeah.
So they both got to be treated the same. And I don't know that you need some formal system. You do need a system in place that encourages reporting, and it needs to be addressed very strongly during the training. So I sitting there trying to think, what's the best way to get employees to report? I mean, if you have a situation where you don't let employees take cell phones out on the work site and there's no way to notify anyone, they're working in kind of a remote area of the site. I mean, think about that during your risk assessment and come up with some sort of a situation to address that as well. But I think back in my loss control days, and I know so many situations where a foreman would just pick on a new hire. This was in the, roofing contractor, one specific I could think of in the Midwest, and they just had a hard time hiring people. And this foreman would scare him off the job because he just would write them. He thought they were, he was old school, and he didn't like the fact that, this individual thought he had to wear fall protection because he was trained to wear fall protection, where this employee felt intimidated. And I remember when I was doing loss control, that came on site and felt like he had to say something to me. And then I said, well, I'll definitely take it up with the safety director who I was working with. And he's like, no, don't do that. He says, he wanted some other option. And it's like, gosh, those are the situations where it comes down to hiring practices and just evaluating your staff, your employees, to where they're going to encourage that reporting. And it really does come down to liability. Your liability is so much greater if you don't implement some of these best practices and at least make an attempt, like John said, at least get the program in writing, obviously customize it. Don't just put your name on it and slap it out there and say, here's our program. Do the risk assessment, build it into it, make this thing very specific. Maybe you got one for your office settings and one for your job sites. All right, so you got two different programs. Get some of that basic stuff down so that your liability at the very least is reduced. Now, maybe you won't reduce the frequency of workplace violence. Maybe you reduce the severity, whatever it is. It doesn't matter in the end. If you have that incident, you're going to be glad you got a program in place, because when push comes to shove and you get into the legal system over this, having done your due diligence and implemented some of these best practices, whether it's all of them or some of them, it's going to help in the end. It could be the difference between $1 million liability settlement versus 10. And I don't want to make this all about money, but from a business standpoint, sometimes, and that's what people higher up there making these decisions have to understand, that, this isn't just, hey, you need to put a slippery when wet sign up in a shower because we want to, that's an obvious thing, right? But it's about reducing the liability. And that's what all of this is really about when push comes to shove. And along the way, if you do it right, you're going to reduce the frequency and hopefully the severity of these violent incidents. And that's our ultimate goal, to reduce those incidents and save money.
Yeah, have everybody home at the end of the day and your business thriving, and everybody understanding the importance of, all of these safety measures and policies and protocols that may seem heavy-handed or, lots of paperwork, but at the end of the day, that's what is going to keep, again, your crew happy and going home at the end of the day and your business thriving, right?
There's some studies out there, and I can share the link. It's done through the American Hospital Association. It's really kind of effective. They show some case studies on what workplace violence prevention has done for them in terms of reducing incidents and saving money. There's several of them. One of them is right here in Omaha, CHI, where my son works. He's a nurse practitioner there, and I'm reading through that thing, and that's kind of cool. They did a 3-year study. So if you're looking for, granted, I couldn't find any construction companies where these studies have been implemented yet, but if you're looking for the impact that workplace violence prevention can have on a workplace, there's a lot of case studies out there that have shown that to be a very significant tool in reducing the severity and frequency.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I think it's about time to open up for Q&A. I noticed we don't have any Q&A yet in the chat, but if anybody in the audience would like to add in their questions, you just select the Q&A button at the bottom there. We'll keep a close eye on that. And I guess in all the questions that we've gone through so far, Steve and John, is there anything that you feel, we need to restate or reaffirm or discuss that we haven't talked about yet?
I do think there's, kind of following up on what Steve just said, I do think there's something that folks probably need to be thinking about, which is, what OSHA penalties look like relative to this. And, you've got the general citation, which is, as much as 15,000 and change. And then there's some factors that can drive it up or drive it down. The serious, which is 18,000, and then the next level, which is 25,000. But if you think about, kind of big picture, some sort of workplace violence event, and I don't know how many folks on this call have any experience with workplace violence themselves, but in representing clients in safety matters for 25 plus years, I've had a lot of experience with that. And, these events tend not to be situations where a single person is involved. And by that, I mean as the victim. These tend to be situations where you may have a primary victim, primary perpetrator, but then you've got folks that are trying to break up the fight. You've got, folks that are hit by a stray gunfire. You've got, whatever else is going on. And so you end up with multiple people. And if you think about, you don't have a plan in place, you haven't trained on the plan, excuse me, you don't maintain a log, you start racking up, 3 citations times 6 people or 4 people or whatever it is, that can get to be a pretty significant kick. And then corresponding with that, while you may not have first party liability because you may have workers' compensation that protects you from your own employees being involved in a situation, if you don't have a plan and some third party, you're on a job, an employee of another contractor or a delivery person or whatever it is the victim, there's no limit on what your liability is because you don't have a workers' compensation bar that's going to protect you from their claims. And even with your own claims, you've got the serious and willful or whatever the terminology is relative to that kind of higher level of workers' compensation claim. And that all of a sudden exposes you for 150% of the value of the claim. So, to Steve's point, there's a lot of impacts here. Healthcare is carved out because CalOSHA has carved out healthcare because for years they've regulated it there. But you can look at what the experience is there. And there's a lot of really simple things you can do to minimize the risk of workplace violence in the workplace. And a lot of it is just good HR practices. Not allowing bullying, not allowing harassment of any kind, not allowing, kind of your typical things that HR policies are addressed to deal with.
Yeah.
And it looks like we do have a couple Q&A questions that just came in.
Great. Excellent. Yeah. Go ahead, Sam. Why don't you read through those?
All right. First one comes from John. Is there a requirement for anonymous reporting?
Yes. And John, you're more on the legal side. I'm gonna let you maybe respond to that more in depth, but definitely yes.
Yeah, so from the standpoint of the reporting requirement, and look, we're kind of guessing a little bit about what the future is going to look like because the standards board has yet to actually issue OSHA standards on this. But I agree with Steve. I think you have to have an anonymous reporting mechanism because you have to have a mechanism that ensures that people are not subject to retaliation. You know, a lot of workplace violence, I don't know what the statistics are outside of healthcare, but I would anticipate it's very, very high, 75, 80% at least is the result of bullying. And so, or harassment or whatever, whatever iteration of that you want to describe that escalates. And, people who are the victims of that oftentimes are concerned about whether it's the employer is going to retaliate or the perpetrator is going to retaliate. So having a anonymous reporting system is beneficial. I'll tell you what I see across my client base. Across my client base, those that have anonymous reporting mechanisms, and I mean truly anonymous reporting mechanisms, who can articulate how those mechanisms work and how those mechanisms both ensure that the company is taking action, give the reporter a means to check to see that the company is taking action, as well as basically compel the company to take action. OSHA looks at those completely different than workplaces that don't have an anonymous system, particularly that don't have anonymous systems that have all those little built-in bells and whistles. Those bells and whistles will save your bacon more often than you can believe.
Yep. No, so I did say CalOSHA doesn't specifically write in the standard that it has to be anonymous, but they do say you need to include provisions that will encourage reporting.
Right.
And that could include, and it should include, in my opinion, anonymous notifications. So
agreed. One slight minor clarification though, Steve. CalOSHA hasn't yet issued its rules.
That's true. It's a statute. Yep, I know.
This is a statute.
By the end of this year, is it?
2025.
Yeah, by January 1, 2025, they're required, I think, to. So you're right. And then another thing that should be mentioned with regards to that, we're talking about a workplace law that's going to go into effect here in July, but codified, is it? Maybe I don't want to speak on in first of next year.
Right.
Yeah. So CalOSHA kind of did this with the heat stress prevention program, right? They codified that, and that's become a requirement now that it's very specific to the state of California, but also now at the OSHA federal level, their operations outside of California are having to deal with that. And this workplace violence prevention program is going to follow the same suit in my mind. So I know a lot of folks probably on this call have operations outside of California. It makes sense now if you're going to implement this program is to implement it company-wide. It's not necessarily have to be California specific. I can almost guarantee you it's going to come through at the federal level. And granted, it may take several years. Federal government is really slow with the implementation of those type of programs. But at the very least, they're going to get you under the general duty clause. It's a known hazard. You've implemented in the state of California. You got employees working in Arizona, and you don't implement the plan there. It doesn't make sense, right? Because you've identified it as a hazard. You didn't take steps to protect them there. So definitely, and I imagine most of you would roll this program out to any operations outside of California as well.
So
yeah, good point.
we do have another Q&A question. Panel's ready. Will OSHA be requiring these logs to be turned in on a yearly basis like the 300 logs? And that question is from Juan.
I don't know. I mean, it remains to be seen. I think it's going to depend upon what the standards board does. The legislation itself does not indicate that that's a requirement.
You just have to log it when it happens.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
It's my understanding, John, you can clarify that, that log has to be made available to employees or the representatives within a certain time frame if they ask to see it.
Correct.
And of course, if CalOSHA showed up, you'd have to be able to provide it to them as well if they ask.
Correct. Correct. And you don't get to delay that. I mean, the delay will cause a citation and penalty in and of itself.
Mm.
And I mean, look, we all, I'm not gonna say we all, I mean, I certainly have been late with getting homework done or whatever. And, they aren't going to accept the dog ate it type excuses, give you some time to generate it. And so, yeah, you have to have it and you have to be able to turn it over in 4 hours. That's what I would expect. I mean, we got to see what the standards board does.
Yeah. Something to definitely keep in mind in terms of when you're putting in your plan and then figuring out where you're going to log things. How do you make it readily accessible?
Yeah. And I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
I'd already mentioned this, but I'll reiterate it because I do think this is important. For some period of time, whether it's a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, I would anticipate, kind of like federal OSHA does with regard to heat injury and illness prevention programs, that's going to be kind of a standard question across the board or standard document request across the board. Show us your workplace violence prevention program. And, it could be, there was a fire, it could be, something collapsed, it could be all kind of things completely unrelated to workplace violence. But I think to ensure that employers have done what they're supposed to do, I think pretty much on every inspection for the next some period of time, you're going to see CalOSHA inspectors asking for proof that you have a program in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, something readily accessible you can pull out to respond to that as quickly as you can. I don't see any more questions. I know one of the questions we did not ask during our open Q&A was labor unions. And I know that some of the people on this call work, some working all with unions, some, here and there. Is there anything different around their participation in the creation or execution of these plans?
Steve, you want
to? I thought maybe that was more on the legal side that you might want to address, but.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm happy to address it. So I would expect that the union is going to have the opportunity to participate in the creation of the document. The reality is at this point in time, and again, we're reasonably good at prognosticating. So I think it's probably pretty fair to say, expect that if you have a unionized workforce, your union is going to participate in the creation of your workplace violence prevention program, as well as the hazard assessment process in determining what hazards exist in your workplace and whether or not your program is effective. I would expect at least in those 3 areas, you're going to have to involve your union.
Yeah, makes sense. Another stakeholder in the whole business, right?
Yep.
So, well, great. I mean, I think we can start to think about wrapping up unless there's any final questions from the audience. I know one of the questions that was answered offline was, will there be a recording of this available? And yes, there will be. So if you want to share it with your team, refer to it back when you're trying to get started on your plan. We'll make it available as soon as the recording comes through on our end. But why don't we take a minute and go around with John and Steve, get some closing remarks from them, and we can wrap it up. John, why don't you kick us off? Yeah.
Okay. Look, this is a serious situation. This is a serious issue. If any employer on this call has experienced workplace violence situation, whether it's something that percolated up through your workplace or whether it's something that a third party brought into your workplace, you know that it can have a devastating effect and that this can be, really, really hard for your employees to come back from. CalOSHA's motivations here, I truly believe, are good, solid, and motivated by everything positive. I don't think that this is a situation where people can really grouse a whole lot about government overreach or the government getting into our business where it doesn't need to be in our business. But having said that, there's also kind of the corollary to that is this imposes an obligation and expectations on employers and, quite frankly, your employees as well. I mean, they have to meaningfully participate in this process. Get involved. I mean, if you haven't looked at the template, the template is a solid starting block. Build off the template. Do this as a serious exercise. I think for most employers, this is not going to be a one and done thing, but I think that the heavy lift is the first time around, and after that, it's going to be a little bit easier. And then, spend some serious time training your folks. Whether you're talking about emergency call buttons or other types of devices that allow people to communicate that they're in danger, or whether you're talking about, de-escalation techniques or, any one of a number of different topics, each of these takes some time, and you can't just jam this into, a 20-minute toolbox talk. So, this is a good thing. This is going to take some time. This is going to take some effort, and this is going to consume some resources. But in the end, I think it's going to be worth everybody's while. Steve?
Yeah, definitely. To me, I think that template is obviously an excellent starting point to get this ball rolling if you haven't already. The hardest part, in my opinion, is going to be evaluating the risks, trying to determine where those acts of violence are coming from. I mean, John, you mentioned a drive-by shooting. That's something as we've been preparing for this, I'm thinking of all the different scenarios, one that didn't cross my mind. So again, use that multidisciplinary approach, get as many people involved in this process as you can, and get as much intake as you can to identify where those risks are, because it's like this situation I shared with you and my wife at work, where a situation occurred in an exam room versus, the active shooter training that they provided. Now they're backpedaling, trying to figure out how to adjust their plan to mitigate that risk. You're probably not going to get everything the first time through, but do your best to get as many of those as you can. That's going to be the hardest part, is building that into that written plan and identifying what are you going to do to mitigate the risk and putting that in the plan. Get as much help as you can on that. And that would be my suggestion, whether it's a safety consultant, again, anybody with experience in that area is going to be very helpful for you. So.
Great. Well, I couldn't think of two better people to have this conversation with. So really appreciate your time. I mean, leverage that template, and then all the people around you, all the different stakeholders, so that you're really digging deep into what could the risks be because of the type of work that we do and where we work and the type of people we work with and all of those variables, and bring that all together. Sam, you pulled up the resource slide. There's some ways to connect with all of us here, and the resources themselves from CalOSHA. You want to say a few last words to close us out, Sam?
Sure. I want to thank Steve and John and Janan. Thank you so much for participating in this. I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody in the audience learned as well. I think we can walk away with something actionable. So I'm really appreciative of the conversation, and then also very appreciative of the questions that were asked by the audience. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.